Hello! Welcome back to my channel. Today, we're going to be talking about A Song of Ice and Fire, the first book, A Game of Thrones. We're going to go over a few different things today. So warning, if you haven't read it and you want to, or you haven't seen the show and you want to watch it, there are going to be spoilers ahead. I'm spoiling the entire book. First, we are going to summarize the plot, and then I'm going to talk about the characters and some of the similarities and differences between the book characters and the show characters. And last, I'm going to give you my review of the book. So I will put timestamps below if you want to skip ahead to any one of those parts. And let's just get started with this. First, let's talk about the plot and summarize that a little bit. If you have watched the show, the plot is basically the exact same as season 1. It differs very little. So there are sort of three main stories. This first storyline is what's happening in Westeros, the kind of political storyline. The old Targaryen king was overthrown by this guy, King Robert. King Robert was part of Robert's rebellion. Ned Stark helped him with that rebellion. So they were both really good friends growing up. Ned Stark helped him with that rebellion, and together they overthrew and won against the kind of mad king. He was like not a great guy. And so they overthrew him. There's some complicated details with that. If you want to know those, just read it. But the main idea is that they've had a new king for like, I think 15 years-ish. And Ned helped him become king and chose not to rule, chose to go back to the north where he's from, to his castle Winterfell, and just be Warden of the North, Lord of Winterfell. So he kind of gave up, honestly, the opportunity to be king. He did not want that life. But when the hand of the king dies, the king asks Ned to come down to the capital city at King's Landing and be the new hand of the king. And that's kind of where all of this political drama starts for Ned. And he's like a really simple, honorable man, so he does not know how to play the Game of Thrones. He finds out that Robert's children are not actually his children. They're like bastards born of incest. His wife was cheating on him with her brother. He finds this out. He's like, hey, like these are not rightful heirs, like this is an issue. But then Robert dies really suddenly. So that's kind of when everything comes into play. Robert dies really suddenly hunting, and his illegitimate son Joffrey becomes the new king. And that's an issue. He's not the rightful heir, and he's also so horrible. Ned Stark had taken his daughters with him to King's Landing because his older daughter Sansa was supposed to marry Joffrey, and then Ned Stark is murdered for treason because he's trying to speak out about Joffrey not being the rightful heir. He is beheaded for treason. And his daughters are sort of captive in King's Landing. They can't really leave. So back in the north, his wife Catelyn and his oldest son Robb, who's still only 15, basically start a war over this. And so that's kind of where we start to get into like the War of the Five Kings. Meanwhile, Jon Snow, who is Ned Stark's bastard son, is in the north at the Wall. So he goes to the Wall to become part of something called the Night's Watch. The Night's Watch, they have this big tall wall that protects them from things in the far north, like some sinister things. They say it's basically only the wildlings, but I believe the wall was built to protect from the others, who are like a supernatural sort of zombie situation. That's like the simple way of putting it. They're like these undead, supernatural beings. So those are called the Others. North of the Wall, they find out that the Others are back or still alive or still whatever. and Jon Snow saves their Lord Commander of the Night's Watch from an undead person. So up north at the Night's Watch, they're protecting the realms of men. That's their job. But they are a brotherhood, and they're a sworn brotherhood, and you're not allowed to leave. So that's kind of the big thing that's difficult for Jon in this book, is he keeps hearing all this bad news about his family. And even though he's a bastard, like, Ned Stark is his father, so he wants to like go and help, and he can't because he's sworn this vow to stay at the wall and protect the realms of men. The third plot line takes place in Essos. This follows Daenerys Targaryen, who is the last of the Targaryens basically, and she gets married off to a horse lord, a warlord, horse lord of the Dothraki, which is like a nomadic group, a nomadic horse group, I guess. And so this follows her kind of rise in that society and coming into her own. And at the very end of the book, she hatches 3 dragon eggs. So she's gifted these 3 dragon eggs at her wedding to Khal Drogo, who is the Dothraki horse lord. And at the end of the book, he climbs onto his funeral pyre after he dies, and she climbs in with her 3 dragon eggs that were supposed to be stone. They were supposed to be petrified. And she climbs out of that fire generally unharmed, and her dragon eggs hatched in the fire, and she climbs out with 3 baby dragons. And so that's like the end of the first book. And so it's very cool to see her progression from like a meek 13-year-old to the mother of dragons. So on to the next portion of this video, which is characters. As somebody who watched the show first, I think it's really interesting to be able to have that point of view perspective of the character, because you get like that internal dialogue, you get their thoughts that you might not really get on the show, and it makes a huge difference, in my opinion, as to how like the characters are perceived and how much their actions make sense. One of the biggest things I actually noticed was Ned Stark's internal dialogue, and what a big difference that made for making him a more dimensional character. So it makes his actions make way more sense, in my opinion. I also think that he just comes off as a little bit more intelligent in the book. The next character I thought was actually quite different in the book was Bran. Bran fell a little bit flat on the TV show. We didn't have enough of the information to really understand fully where he was coming from. And in the book, we once again have his internal thoughts. We have his internal dialogue. We understand like his hopes and his dreams, like that he really wants to become a knight, and he loves climbing. Like they talk about it in the show, but it is so much deeper in the book. Like he only feels alive when he climbs, basically, and it's everything to him. There was a moment where he talks about being excited to go to King's Landing so he can meet Barristan the Bold, who is a knight that he admires because he wants to be a knight. And those little details make it that much more heartbreaking when he's pushed from the tower. It really cuts a little bit deeper, and it hits you a little bit harder. The next character that I thought had a lot more depth in the books was Jon Snow. He goes north to the Wall when he's 14. So we know that he wishes he were a true-born son. We know he doesn't like being a bastard. However, it is expressed that much more deeply in the book. So like obviously you wouldn't like being a bastard, but I think in the book we really understand like his frustration in not knowing who his mom is, like being a blood son, or thinking he's a blood son of Ned Stark, but not being on equal footing with Robb or Bran. And that's really heartbreaking, that he kind of is like, well, I don't even know where else to go, so I'll just go to the Wall. He doesn't like it. He doesn't want to be there. He feels like he's away from his family. And yes, he makes new brothers with like Sam and Pip and Gren and all those people. I think we understand a little bit more of like his heartbreak and where he's coming from in the books. Jon Snow comes off a little bit one note in the show, and that's just because we don't have access to his thoughts. It's more interesting to read about him. I will say that like some of the characters translated better to the screen than others. Like Arya is like almost exactly the same. I think there's actually like very little difference, and I think they were able to convey a lot of her inner thoughts pretty easily through the writing and the acting. But as I said, some of these just don't translate that well to the screen. So Jon Snow was definitely one of those where I was like, wow, this character is so much more interesting in the book. Ooh, also Catelyn. Catelyn was definitely a character that they played up her strengths, like her good qualities, and they really only mentioned one time like her treatment of Jon Snow, but honestly it's an ongoing thing that she was pretty bad to Jon Snow. Like she did not treat him well in the books and had some serious animosity towards him. Understandably so, but they definitely played it down for the show. So that's like my one thing about her. As well, she has, and I don't think they really talk about this much in the show, but in the book, her father's sick. She does end up going to him after some of the battles that she fights with Robb, and those were like some of the just sweetest moments in the story. It was really nice to read, and again, like it gives that kind of extra layer to the character. Lysa. I remember in the show being just like, she is so nutty. And I don't think they had the backstory or the time maybe to convey why she was truly that nutty. She's had like, I forget how many, but like 5 or 6 like stillbirths and miscarriages. So that gives us a little more perspective as to why she might be so nutty. And I think part of it is also just the way she ended up being and Littlefinger's manipulation. But I mean, I think it's a really important context to have that she had like tons of stillbirths and miscarriages. And so that kind of explains why she's so weird with her son. I know like definitely descriptively Tyrion is very different, but I think the way that he reads is exactly how he is in the show, maybe a notch harsher. But I think we can chalk that up to the fact that Peter Dinklage is like very charismatic, and so maybe he kind of makes Tyrion feel a little bit more charismatic than he is in the books. Okay, so last are my general thoughts and my review. Generally, I thought it was addictive. Even though I already know the way the story is going to turn out, I couldn't stop reading. I could not put it down. Basically, all my free time was just like reading a Game of Thrones. Despite knowing the ending, I still couldn't put it down. I was like, this is so good, and it's definitely different. And I would highly recommend, even if you've already seen the show. It is better than the show. I know people always say the book is better, and it's basically always right. There is so much more depth to the characters. Some of the actions in the show that you're a little bit like, why would you do that? Or like, please don't do that. They make a little more sense once you're in that character's shoes, in their mind, like reading their thoughts. And the details of the book, I think it adds like such a richness to the story that makes you really picture things and feel like you're there and like experience it. And I think that it's great writing when you can evoke multiple senses, because it transports you a little bit more and it keeps you in that story. So complain all you want about all of those like descriptions, but I think those are what make it so good and what make you just stay in that story and then ultimately want to keep reading it. The writing is good. It is so highly descriptive, and it's kept really interesting by switching point of views. The book is always better. I don't even know what else to say. Oh my gosh, there's dog hair on it. I would highly recommend this book. I think that even if you're not a big fantasy reader, you will enjoy it. I think that even if you've already seen the show, you will enjoy it. And I think that generally it's just good writing. If you enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments that you want to add, honestly, please comment them down below because I would love to discuss this. Like, I don't have enough people to discuss it with. Tell me if you felt the same way, if you felt differently, if you want to read it, if you already have. I will see you later.